You're very welcome to the next episode of our Work From Anywhere series. Today, we're going to be tackling HR, payroll, employers of record. We've got Meltem Kuran from Deel, Kathleen Paolo of Wanderers Wealth, and Fran Keating from remotecontrol.io. Next week, we've got another fantastic lineup. Chase Warrington runs the About Abroad podcast, top 10 remote work podcast in the world. Denise Browder of Sway Workplace, and we've got Robert Glazer of Acceleration Partners. He has written a book, How to Thrive in a Virtual Workplace. So stay tuned, and thanks for any questions you've got for us. We'd love to hear them. Hi everyone, you are very welcome to the next episode in our Work From Anywhere series. This week and next week, we're going to have a key overarching topic, and that's going to be the Great Migration. And with that in mind, just here are a couple of statistics to give you some food for thought. So the first one is that Monster.com reported that over 95% of people are considering quitting their jobs. This is just in the last week. Linked to that, Steve Cadigan, the first HR director of LinkedIn, he talks about the great professional jobs migration, but what if you also have an actual employee migration abroad, for example, with Work From Anywhere? And when it comes to Work From Anywhere, according to a survey that we did a couple of weeks ago, the key pain points for both employers and employees were actually tax. So with that in mind, we'll be able to discuss that and dive into it further with our fantastic panel today. So I'd like to invite the panel on screen. And if you don't mind, it'd be great for you guys to introduce yourselves. Maybe starting with Meltem, would you like to give yourself a quick intro to yourself and Deel?
Yeah, for sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Meltem. I'm actually connecting today from Istanbul, Turkey, where I'm visiting my family. I'm the head of growth at Deel, and Deel is an international compliance and payroll platform that allows companies to hire anyone, anywhere, within 5 minutes without having to worry about all the overhead that comes with the space. Before Deel, I had my fair share of other marketing gigs. I started my career at then from there went into tech, played around a little bit at eBay, and then joined Deel from there.
Great. And Kathleen, would you like to give yourself a bit of background to yourself and Wanderers Wealth?
Hello, everybody. I'm Kathleen, and I help digital nomads, location-independent entrepreneurs with the international tax situation. And I used to work as an international tax lawyer, and 3 years ago, I quit my corporate job to travel the world. And now I've become a digital nomad myself and help mostly self-employed people with their taxes as opposed to employees.
Great. Thank you very much. And Fran, tell us more about yourself and remote control.
Hi there. Thanks for having me, John. And hello, everyone. I'm Fran, co-founder of Remote Control. We help businesses improve their remote working setup by helping them find the right tools and solutions to do that. We work with businesses to fix pain points really in areas within communications or people operations, culture, and of course digital tools. And we set up the business with the belief that the 9 to 5 is now obsolete, and there's a huge opportunity out there now to make remote working accessible for everyone. Prior to setting up the business, I have 12 years in financial services within communications and change management experience. So I've worn many hats in that area.
Great, thank you very much. And by the way, for any of you here in the audience, feel free to share any comments or questions that you have, or where you're dialing in from as well. Would be great to hear. And I guess the first question for the speakers is, we've all heard about this Monster.com reports of 95% of employees considering quitting their jobs. We've heard about the Great Migration. I'd like to ask you all, give us your take on the Great Migration and where this is going. Maybe Meltem, you can kick us off.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of companies kind of see this as, the pandemic happened, so everybody had to work from home. Some people want to go back and visit their families. And now everybody's going to go back to the office. I hear a lot of people think that, but I think what really happened in the past 2 years is we were all forced into this pilot to see how the world could work. And it actually functioned pretty well. Certainly, if you work in a factory, it's difficult for you to be away. But for those people that I would consider as knowledge workers, you can see in a lot of companies that their profits went up. People were working harder. They had to commute less, so they were more focused on their work. So I see this as if we were forced into this pilot, and a lot of companies are not necessarily going to take on a fully remote, but a remote hybrid model where they have certain teams in international places and certain people won't have to come into the office.
Right, and how about yourself, Kathleen? Fascinating angle on that, Meltem. What about yourself, Kathleen? How do you see the Great Migration?
I guess from my perspective, it's almost like I was a remote worker before it was cool, and we were kind of the outsiders a couple of years ago, and now we like belonging, you know, everyone is within that trend and everyone's seeing the benefits from being able to be a remote worker. So I'm really glad to see that shift happening, because before it always felt like, oh, how are digital nomads able to live on the road and to work and travel at the same time? And now everyone's opening up to that opportunity and possibility that maybe it can be possible for anyone. And it seems that whether or not someone is able to work remotely is quite high up on that list when they're deciding for which company to go. So yeah, that's an amazing factor.
And I suppose there's so many different angles to that. I mean, Meltem talked about she's dialing in from from Istanbul, being there with family. For some people, it's going to a beach in Thailand, whereas others it's being back close to family. So very different motivations for it. Maybe just simply exploring a new culture, for example. But then, Fran, how do you see it? What's your take on that as well, on the Great Migration and where that's going to?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting stat that's come across, and I guess the pandemic has caused us to reevaluate a lot and think about a mindset shift. I'd be really curious to find out, with the survey, a lot of people will talk about making a decision to make a move, but like what will unfold in the next few years would be particularly interesting, and what will companies do to make sure that they retain like their key talent. So that would be really interesting. But overall, I think that it's great news for companies like ours, as there's an opportunity for us to make this migration as smooth as possible and help people with the big decisions that they have to make in their own lives.
Yeah, great point. And then I suppose looking at big picture then for, you talk about employers of record, Meltem, with this great migration that we talk about, what does this mean for hiring internationally, but also then the role of employers of record? They've become much more popular. A lot of people talking about them. When is the right moment to use an employer of record, for example?
I think so. A lot of companies are going to have different things that they need to consider. So there's no right answer for any company. And I think, you always need to consult with people that know what they're talking about, because every country is different. Every company is different. But employer of record, in my opinion, is the first place that you should go and explore with to say, I'm trying to hire someone in XYZ country. Do I have to set up my own subsidiary? Excluding the risks that you may run into legally, it's your first and easiest bet to kind of get going in a local place. So I would suggest that it's the first place that people look once they've just made the decision to hire a certain individual in any country.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's a great way of putting it. I suppose it's a concept, if I'm not mistaken, Meltem, that didn't really exist much maybe 20, 30 years ago, but certainly with this kind of great migration kicking in, it's going to be something that's going to be more and more important into the future. But then I guess, Kathleen, if you look at it, how do you see it with, let's say, if I'm a remote worker and I want to go abroad, I don't want to pay very little tax, where do I go and how do I go about it?
I mean, best place to go would always be a tax haven on an island, Caribbean island, where you don't have any tax obligations and there's no personal taxes. But obviously that might not be the case for everyone, that they can just move to an island. Definitely want to go somewhere where I guess the laws are easier to comply with. They're a bit more flexible. We see even within the US, compliance rules can be so complex, even within the different states. So if there's like a employee that sits in one state and then they go over to and cross the border, there can be so many issues even within one country, let alone if we look at across Europe. So those are like two places where it can be really complicated. So you want to make sure that you find a place where compliance rules are easier than in other places, and also where you have low taxes and where you might be able to stay even out of personal tax obligations, that as well.
Interesting. So, I mean, that's something that's going to be much more in vogue now over the next couple of years. I suppose optimizing your tax was maybe more for billionaires before, whereas now I guess it's going to be something remote workers are going to be looking at. I guess, Fran, then looking at that, what kind of practical solutions are you seeing adopted by HR teams when it comes to work from anywhere? And I saw a comment there from Kaylee. Great chat, guys. What do you think is the biggest challenge for HR from work from anywhere? So dealing with those two aspects, how would you look at that, Fran?
Yeah, well, I mean, in fairness, some others are doing better than some HR are doing better than others. And by and large, there's a lot more planning to be done. So take, for example, the tech industry. You've seen they've been more forward-looking in setting up practices and HR platforms to support that and to enable people to work from anywhere. But other industries have just stopped with the adoption of digital tools. So there is quite a fair place to go. But what we've seen, which is really exciting, and like the most innovative HR platforms, HR companies are they're really adopting like a remote first process for teams, even if they're in a hybrid approach. So for example, desktop meetings, like this, all of this to help combat isolation for people who are set up to work remotely. They've also adopted the approach of ditching the annual surveys and running regular pulse surveys to really dig into the data behind what's going on with their employees and how they can support them in working from anywhere. I guess the other thing is if they want to be forward thinking, they're setting their communication principles around all these policies, and they're sharing them with their employees, and they're adopting new solutions like I've heard of like no meetings Fridays or flight mode Mondays. So it's just all processes to support employees that are not location in the office.
That's a good point. And managing the notifications is something we all have the challenge with. And I'm looking at two of these questions coming through here. Great ones for Meltem. Rebecca Huff, maybe if we could pull that question up again, and from Alonka. Rebecca says, a trend I'm seeing is local workers wanting to take 6 to 12 months international trips and work remote. Would an Interorder relationship help companies with existing employees versus a new hire? What would be your take on that, Meltem?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, it definitely can. However, there's one thing that needs to be kept in mind. When let's say you come to Deel and we're employing this person named John on your behalf because they want to work from Hawaii for 6 months. The contract that we would set up with John is one that would have, if we terminate John, we would need to pay a certain severance. So the contract would need to be edited to say that both parties are acknowledging that the end of this relationship is within 6 months. And at that point, John is going to be transferring back to the original entity where he belongs. As long as that's taken care of, EORs can certainly help. Good
to know. Because I think maybe there's some people have the misconception that EORs are just for people on longer than 12-month contracts. The next question from Alonka, again, probably put this one out for whichever you want to take it. Alonka says, what about the employer's perspective in this regard? Should this not be a joint decision between an employee and an employer? Who wants to take that one?
I can take an initial stab at it, and then I'm sure everybody has opinions. I definitely think it should be a joint decision between the employer and the employee. The relationship needs to work for both. I know, I've spoken to a few people that are in businesses like consulting, and they just don't think that first-year associates can actually learn the job. If you're working at Bain, McKinsey, those places, they actually want people to be in the room. So going to them and saying be fully remote might not be completely feasible, at least for certain roles. So it definitely needs to be a decision that both parties have a say in.
Yep, great point.
I might take it.
Yeah, go first, Kathleen.
Step on that from the tax side perspective, because I've seen a statistic that said that remote workers have decided to actually move away, even if it's from the city, across the state border somewhere else. About 30% don't really tell HR and tell their employees, and I think that's the first approach that's completely wrong. I definitely think employers and employees should be working together and setting clear ground rules of whether or not it is an option and who is going to figure out, for example, tax implications or payroll taxes or social security contributions, and divide the different obligations between the two parties. But there should definitely be some communication between both parties.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And then coming back to those risks then, Meltem, one of the questions as well I had here before is when it comes to EORs, there's a bit of uncertainty around the corporation tax side, like the permanent establishment risk, but also things like, for example, contractor misclassification. Is that something you see come up, and how do you address that?
So it's certainly something that we see come up. For example, it's very difficult to hire someone who's going to be working 40 hours for you in France can call them an independent contractor. So it depends on which countries what can you do. So I typically live in Canada. I spend most of my time there. In Canada, it's really no problem. Nobody really looks into it as long as you take care of things like I need to work on my own laptop. However, it needs to be taken from a case-by-case basis, which is always, it's a good idea to talk to someone who actually understands the nuances of not just the person that you're hiring and what kind of a role are they going to do, because that's where, if you're hiring someone who's going to be revenue generating, you're potentially running into permanent establishment risk, but also the country they're going to be in and what are the local laws of that company.
Yeah, great example of that. And on the misclassification side, we're seeing the likes of the UK, IR35, for example, a major risk when you're hiring a contractor. If you haven't got the procedures and policies and controls in place, you could have it illegally, could be a contractor, but actually in substance, if it's like an employee, they should be taxed accordingly, let's say. So yeah, lots of minefields to navigate here. And then I think maybe taking a big picture back, Kathleen, if you look at, let's say, the evolution of corporation tax, in many ways, it was a race to the bottom as well. But we've seen, at least with the G7 announcement a couple of weeks ago, that there's been at least a floor put in place for some of the big tech companies. Do you think we're at maybe a risk of a race to the bottom when it comes to, remote workers and the income tax side of it?
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's one of the biggest incentives right now, and tax incentives, if you want to call it, that's been designed because, tourism is down. So there's not too many foreigners coming into countries that usually contribute a lot to the economy. So now the second best thing is getting in residents. So bringing in foreigners who are really going to live within the country and raising that way revenue for the countries. And how a country is doing that? By giving them tax incentives. So saying, you get a 6-month permit or a 12-month permit and you won't have any tax obligations during that time within our country. So there's definitely going to be a race for who is going to be designing the best digital nomad visa or remote workers visas. And it's also going to be so helpful to companies to figure out, okay, which countries can we send our employees to, and basically almost have like a list of places that are easy for employees to work remotely from.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, at the end of the day, the concept of true work from anywhere, where you can work anywhere you want in the world, that's just not realistic because of the compliance and tax and legal challenges of it, let's say. But like you say, trying to pick a certain number of countries could be something to look at. But then I guess, Fran, looking at all these challenges, how do you weave this together into a coherent HR and global mobility strategy?
Well, I think we've certainly touched on it with the conversation we're having now, which is it is based on a conversation. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, right? And it's based on having the conversations with your employees to find out, like, okay, what do employees enjoy most about working at the company, and setting about a framework to replicate how you can do that remotely and asynchronously. So the rollout of a program would be very much based on an employee-employer conversation and helping that. You also, I'd say, need to look at what each department is doing and how they can do it remotely and what their dependencies are, and how you can get your employees up to speed very quickly. And there's been a lot of conversations and a lot of insights around remote onboarding, which is, when remote boarding is done right, is actually can get people up to speed super quickly. And then, of course, there's a lot of advantages that you can take as well by designing your own program. You can have that wider access to your talent pool. And then if you're working with people that are more flexible, there's a much higher job satisfaction. So I guess it's it's a tailored program depending on what the company's culture and their mission and values are.
Yeah, great point. And then I suppose if you come back to Meltem, for your case, in the case of Deel, I mean, it's fascinating being an employer of record. How do you guys tackle work from anywhere internally? Like, what are the challenges and opportunities? I mean, how do you tackle this?
Well, so we've been remote since day one. I joined as person number 19. We're now 220 people. We work from across 45 countries. So the way we tackle it is there are certain people that we hire as EORs, other people that we hire as independent contractors, depending on each country. And if people are going to be moving from one location to another, then we reassess, okay, if this person moved from, New York to Tel Aviv, how do we need to maintain our relationship with them? And another big thing that gets asked to us a lot is, how do you compensate people? Do you compensate them by, where we're technically based out of, which is San Francisco, or do you compensate them based off of where they live? If you compensate them based off of where they live, is it normal that, a junior engineer might be making more than their boss who lives in a cheaper place in the world if they're located in San Francisco? So there are all those things that we've, figured out along the way. But
how did you tackle that, for example? For me, that's fascinating, because the localization side, there's so many complexities to it. There's the equity side, but then there's also the challenge of the cost of living side, but then even like social security in France is like, for the employer portion of it is over 40% versus I think Denmark is maybe close to 0%, if I'm not mistaken. So I mean, how do you tackle that in the case of Deel? That's a tricky one, huh?
Yeah. So in terms of equity, everybody gets the same amount of equity. Well, everybody at different job levels get the same amount of equity regardless of where they are.
Well, sorry, maybe let me rephrase it. More like equitable, like a kind of the fairness between workers. If somebody is managing that side of it, but with the localization, do you have like a one size fits all that here's a job, this is the price, this is the salary associated with that particular job, or do you localize it based on cost of living? And then how do you tackle, for example, things like social security? Like the net cost to an employer can be massively different, even for the same salary in two different countries,
Yes. So we do it based off of where people live. So it's specific to each market. So when I post a job opening for a growth engineer, if they're in New York, they get a different salary versus if they're in Istanbul, they get a different salary. So we definitely localize it, and we take into account, what are like someone in Canada, we have free healthcare. So, it's not a huge cost. Someone in US, you actually need to cover that for them. So we just, if they're in a place where we agree on what we're going to provide for our employees, and regardless of where they are, we say we're going to provide them that base level of healthcare and whatever else we decide to add on top of it, and do provide them based on their local differences, which might mean it's a little bit more expensive for us to hire someone out of New York versus Eastern Europe. But the reality is we're looking for the best talent right now. So we just kind of deal with it.
Interesting. Okay. And then Kathleen, one of the things we've also seen linked to this kind of work from anywhere concept is the introduction of digital nomad visas. I mean, there was very few of them, a year ago, and now look how many you've got. I think there's over 30 anyway at last count, if I'm not mistaken. How do you see the intersection between, digital nomad visas and taxes, for example? Some wrap around tax, some don't. And what do you think is the best digital nomad visa in the world?
That's like saying, which country do you prefer the most? But because I think there's one in Barbados, there's one in Bermuda, there's one in Iceland. So I guess which one's the best really depends on what place do you like the most. But in terms of which one I see to be the most competitive ones are some of them that are coming out just right now in Europe. One of the latest one being the Croatian one, where you get 1 year of tax-free living, and to be able to be eligible, you only need to be earning like 2,200 euros per month, which is pretty low compared to the one in Iceland, where you need to be earning $80,000 per year. So they vary significantly, and some of them seem to be more made so to attract the digital nomads, so like self-employed people, as opposed to remote workers who might be already on a higher salary and who could fall within the category of being more so eligible for those higher eligibility requirements. So there's so many sides to it, and also the application fees as well. They vary so much across countries, and in some instances as well, you're able to renew them. And then in other instances, they've pretty much set the bar on, no, it's just 6 months or 12 months.
Yeah. Well, maybe one of the aspects on that, which, when you think about it, is, for the local destinations, for a lot of these that have suffered a lot with COVID, what I heard recently was that if you compare the value to a destination of a leisure traveler versus the value to destination of a remote workers working there for a while, I mean, those remote workers tend to stay there longer. So the spend on average compared to a leisure traveler is at least 10x. So for them, it's very much in their interest. So even if they get payroll tax at 0%, they'll still get a lot of value-added tax receipts, for example, things like that can more than make up. I'm seeing another question come through here from Alonka. Do high-tech startups not have to be compliant, or do they just have to find creative solutions, or do these companies just have a bigger risk appetite in the industry I'm working in, which is financial services? So that's a very, very good point, maybe for you, Meltem. I mean, in many ways, it's like going down a motorway, and you get some people that go let's say the speed limit is 120 kilometers an hour and they do 150, they do it time and time again. And then all of a sudden they get caught eventually by the police, and then all of a sudden they're in trouble, except when it comes to tax. It can have very significant consequences. And going back to Ilanka's question, obviously for financial services, they have a lot of regulation, which means they can't even go outside the country in certain positions, for example. So there's additional heavy regulations on them that prevents financial services from really realizing true work from anywhere. I mean, what would your sense of being that? What would your response to be to, let's say, the concept of startups that are kind of working around the edges around that, or being creative, for want of a better word? How do you see that question from Ilanka?
So, I mean, the reality is no company is exempt from having to be compliant. Everybody gets in trouble. It's true that I see, you see a lot of startups are like, oh, we'll fix it later. Risk appetite. But my advice to all the startups, especially as one who is, grown very recently, is like, you still need to get your ducks in a row. And if you actually want to grow at the rate that you do, you need to make sure that you are compliant. So it's always the best idea to talk to a company that knows what they're doing. At times we have, at Deel, people come to us and they say, I want to hire this person as an independent contractor because I don't want to have to deal with EOR in this country. And we advise them that, like, don't do that. And at times we have to turn people away because they're insistent on doing that. But as a company, we can't knowingly allow them to take that action, knowing that it's going to be a misclassification risk. So oftentimes there are some companies that dig their heads in the sand and they're just like, I'll just PayPal you your salary. They use local, California contracts to hire someone in Germany. That does happen. It's absolutely not best practice. And there's no different set of rules for those companies.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I think, one of the things that you see for startups is that in every country, you typically have like audit regulations that once you're below a certain turnover threshold, you're not audited. But once you get over that threshold, you're audited. And the first time you get audited, these issues are going to spit out straight away. So I think that's one of the things to really watch out for. I mean, then, Fran, if you look at it again, maybe come back to the big picture, what's the biggest blind spot companies have that you've seen when it comes to work from anywhere? And why do you think there's been so much pushback from certain CEOs on this remote work movement, and why didn't they see it coming? And what does it mean then for the future of management, all of this? And how would you tackle those aspects? What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, they're all really good questions. And like, I think the one big thing, a big blind spot that I've seen, and certainly speaking to managers and CEOs, is synchronous working. And, it's just, that's just the big thing that they're getting wrong, is in it might have been easier to implement this replication of the office as we moved online. But, we're seeing now that there is a lot of strain being put on employees, such as Zoom fatigue and burnout. And so it's that really, that is the biggest problem I see that needs to be fixed and addressed. But there's also, just on the other point, is like, why did the CEOs not see it coming? I guess like they didn't anticipate the pandemic, and they may not have put in plan long-term policies and processes in place to make working from anywhere a possibility. But the other point I wanted to make, I guess, around working from anywhere is, we've all seen it. There's been a little bit of a misconception about, if you're working from home, you're not working. And this is before the pandemic. So what we've seen all of the stats and the evidence that we're actually working from home. We're working from anywhere very successfully. So it's a bit of a mindset shift is needed to adjust to this. And I think if you're looking at, once you give people the mental space to design their working day, and if you think about it, like, how does the new future of management look like? It goes to looking like managers are managing virtually. They're looking at your KPIs and they're looking at your output rather than how many hours you're sitting in the office seat, and designing your work around that with weekly check-ins rather than like constantly being on Zoom, using the right tech as well to support your projects. And so you're not constantly getting pings of emails, and you can actually spend meaningful time in deep work. And so if like all of those three strategies are like really great drivers of successful working from anywhere, and that's what the innovative managers are putting in place now.
Thanks for that, Fran. Good to kind of see the different strategies that are being used. I've got one kind of final question I'm going to ask in a bit, but before I ask that, just a random question. You can work from anywhere in the world, yeah? let's say you can work from anywhere in the world for a few months a year. Where would it be and why? Meltem, where would that be for you?
Oh God! Well, I recently made that call to make that Istanbul to see my family, but that's kind of a boring answer because
you know what? It's not, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of people I've been speaking to have had this conception that it is remote workers is mainly who want to work from anywhere is mainly people from North America or from Western Europe that want to go to the beach in Thailand. But actually, what we've seen is it's actually just as much, if not more so. Indian expats working in the US who want to go back to their families, or likewise people from, let's say, Eastern Europe who are working in Western Europe that want to go back to their families. And if you look at it from an intercultural perspective, that's a passion of mine, you see people from collectivistic cultures, very group-oriented cultures, for them, family and their family values and being close to family is hugely important. So, when you say that, for me, I know it's a flippant comment, but it actually is part of a wider trend of the whole work from anywhere trend, which is important not to forget, because we all have cultural biases. And I think that's one of the aspects, like when you say that, for me, that's a very powerful statement,
Yeah, so I guess then I'll stick to my answer is that I would, choose to live my life continuously between Toronto and Istanbul, where I get to spend time with my aging parents and not feel like I'm missing out on all the big moments.
Yeah, it's a great one. And what about for you? Kathleen, what would be for you the number one place you'd love to go spend a few months working abroad
in? For me, it's definitely the factor of kind of living in paradise, if you want to put it that way. So being able to live in an island and to just be able to go to the beach, go for a surf, just be able to combine work-life balance, I would say that's for me the number one priority. So right now I'm in Bali, Indonesia, and that really fits the checklist.
I have reflecting back on it. It's work-life balance. When we did a survey of the motivations for working from anywhere, culture was number one, but work-life balancing was number two. It was our own fault that we didn't put in family as a key reason for working from anywhere. But I'm sure if we did, it would come up very, very high. So that concept of work-life balance or exploring the local culture or family, obviously very, very important motivations. And what about you then, Fran? What would be your number one location if you could work from anywhere?
Well, I have to confess, I feel like I'm already living that out because I relocated from London to Cascais, just outside of Lisbon in Portugal in January. So I feel incredibly lucky to have the work-life balance and the access to nature, access to the nice city. So that's already delighted with that. But I think I might have to catch up with Kathleen and find out all about Bali, because that also sounds like an incredible setup. And I like that the digital nomad community is there. So I think there's a really good setup there. But the list is just growing longer by the day of places that I would like to work from. It means a lot for me to be able to go back to Ireland to see my family. My husband's family are in Spain, so it's just that freedom to work when I need to. Yeah, but Bali's top of the list.
Very important comment as well. I'm seeing coming up here as well from Chrissy Sullivan. She says, "Fran, I totally agree. The stigma of working remotely has changed in the corporate world." So I think that's also a very important thing to tie into the evolution of where this is all going, that the stigma, you're at the pre-pandemic remote worker and the post-pandemic remote worker, very, very different in how companies adjust to that and their company culture working around that. And then kind of tying it all together then, like looking at a final comment, a final question I have for you guys is, we have seen so much change in such a short space of time. The pandemic has accelerated all this change that we often talk about. What do all of you see? Where will the HR and global mobility world be in 10 years' time? How will it look? And what will be the second and third order effects of work from anywhere that we need to watch out for, I guess? So maybe Meltem, do you want to take us off on that?
Yeah, I think of remote work as, computers coming into the workplace. It was a major shift in how people worked. And, I find myself asking my parents, it's like, so what did you do before you had a computer on your desk? Like, what did work look like? Because I can't comprehend what that was. So that was a major moment of shift where the way we worked completely changed. And I think 10 years from now, this conversation is going to be incredibly archaic. It's just going to be like, are you good enough to do the job? And hopefully the governments have set up their tax systems in a way that make it easier than it is today to manage it. That, it won't be, I'm looking to hire an XYZ in this city. It will be, I'm looking for someone to do this job for me. Where's that person? And let me hire them. So I think we're going to be, a decade ahead of this, and it's just going to become the normal practice.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the ability to be able to even just hire talent is the great thing with you guys with Deel. You can hire talent from anywhere in the world, and you've got different solutions like yourselves that can help, help facilitate that. So that's a fascinating one to watch out for. I mean, what would your take being a Kathleen? How do you see it? Where will it be in 10 years' time? And, what are the second and third order effects we need to watch out for?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Meltem that the focus is going to be on who can do the job. Doesn't really matter where they are currently located in. And hopefully governments will have caught up with the digitalized age and put out laws and regulations into place that support that sort of economy. And we've already seen changes within the tax rules and between bilateral agreements between countries to have exceptions during COVID, but now it's been going on for almost 2 years and they're extending it and keep extending the rules. So who knows how long those exceptions will last, because they're no much longer going to be exceptions. They're going to be the new norm. And It's not just with regulations and rules. It's also in terms of infrastructures and people being able to move around, to move to rural areas, the new way of working, not being an office setting, but more so co-working and co-living spaces that integrate even for families to be able to bring their kids into a daycare facility. And it's going to have a huge impact. And I'm excited to be part of this new digitalized age.
Well, yeah, completely. It's funny you say that, because when we did the survey, the second biggest pain point for individuals was actually like kids' education. And I was speaking to the team in the Green School in Bali only earlier this week on it. We'll probably do an episode on the whole kids' education side for remote workers. It's a huge, huge pain point, a huge blocker, let's say. But that's why I think, with the likes of, what the Green School in Bali are doing is very, very innovative. And then homeschooling solutions, virtual schooling, all those things are going to play a really important role. But at the same time, we're also seeing in certain countries culturally, they're very reticent to allow kids to come out of the school during the school term. That's a huge barrier to remote workers. Then that if they can only go during the 3 months of the school holidays or whatever it might be, then that's a huge barrier to being able to, you're going to be paying the high prices. Everyone's going to be abroad. Whereas I think, though, how we see schooling structurally is probably going to change. I don't know if any of you have any comments on that, for example, to make.
I just think it's fascinating. I hadn't considered that aspect. So, Fran, I'll let you talk.
Oh, well, I just think it's fascinating if we're looking at like where we'd be in 10 years, the digital education platforms that are coming out and like decentralized learning. And I think there is like a huge opportunity there. And maybe there might be a lot of changing of minds around, education from anywhere, just like we're working from anywhere set up.
I love that concept, education from anywhere. I think that's a very powerful one. Yeah, I think you're right. You're definitely onto something. And then, Fran, when you look at the second and third order effects that we might not have thought about, we talk about the direct effects, like, for example, with working from home, commercial real estate is going to change. How we live in cities is going to change, for example. When we talk about the tax side as well, Kathleen, one of the aspects that the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland came out with recently was that the marginal tax rates they're going to have to look at reducing, because if they're very high, they're going to be a big disincentive for remote workers, for example. But then for yourself, Fran, what are the second and third order effects you think we might not have thought about or that are worth thinking about in this context?
I guess with the I see in the next few years that certainly companies are already making this move of the removal of HQ and like moving away from the cities into maybe because of the removal of HQ, looking for other locations to have more quality time together within companies. So maybe I see locations popping up that could facilitate that, purpose-built locations for team bond, team collaboration events. The other area that I'm particularly interested in is, if you're offering hybrid works, if hybrid is an option, what will the effects be if say women in the workplace opt to take on a hybrid role, but men opt to actually go into the office? Like, what are the effects of that? Does that mean that if you're not physically present in the office, are you overlooked for promotions. And in order to resolve those problems, you need to ensure that you have a remote first policy for career progression. So there's a couple of other things that are interesting and a lot of people are looking at the moment.
Yeah, very, very, very well made point there. I think that's one of the struggles at the moment that we're seeing, is that you can't do a kind of a 50-50 split of hybrid work. You kind of have to have a bias somewhere, either being primarily office first or primarily virtual first. But listen, thank you very much, all of you, for your fantastic contribution, your really insightful analysis. Really appreciate you all taking the time to be on our Work From Anywhere series. In any case, let's keep in touch. If any of you have any questions for speakers afterwards, you'll be able to get them on LinkedIn. And I guess we'll see you all next week. Thank you very much for coming aboard today, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.